Ever felt like you're just drowning in information, trying to grasp the truth about a really complex region or maybe a deeply rooted issue? You want to cut through the headlines, understand what's really going on, but without getting completely lost in all the details.
Well, today we're doing exactly that. We're taking a deep dive into a pretty fascinating set of sources. It's a collection of blog posts and articles, all written in Arabic by Dr. Murad Agha-Dafdar, and they're from back in March 2008.
Right, and this isn't just some dry historical document. It's a fiercely critical perspective, often quite cynical, really, and it's deeply personal, looking at the state of the Arab world, then its leadership, its societal challenges, all from this one influential voice of that period. Okay, let's really try and unpack this, get to the heart of his observations.
Absolutely. Our mission here is to pull out the most important nuggets of knowledge, the key insights from this specific viewpoint. We want to give you a unique understanding of the frustrations and observations of a critical Arab thinker from, well, over a decade ago now. We'll explore these ideas just as they were presented in the source, aiming to understand their significance, but without us endorsing or, refuting the specific viewpoints ourselves. The deep well of frustration, Arab unity and leadership.
So the author paints this truly vivid, almost heartbreaking picture of profound frustration and disintegration in the Arab world. What exactly does he mean by that? How does he trace its roots?
Well, he attributes it to a whole series of historical, let's call them setbacks. He mentions the 1920 catastrophe, the 1948 Nakba.
That's the displacement of Palestinians around Israel's creation, right?
Exactly. Then the 1967 Naksa, the defeat in the Six-Day War, and he even uses this term, the 1973 Dasa, which means trampling. It emphasizes the perceived humiliation of the Yom Kippur War. And what's fascinating here is his really consistent critique of Arab summits.
The big leadership meetings.
Yeah. He basically describes them as yielding little more than, quote, tsunamis of slogans and wishes. They never translate into anything tangible, any real progress. The source states very explicitly, since then we have not risen again, and we entered an era of submission and complacency.
Wow. So he's not just lamenting a lack of progress. He's saying these grand declarations are almost like a performance, masking the real issues instead of solving them.
That's exactly the sense you get. Performance over substance.
And he contrasts this talk of unity with the reality, which he sees as fragmentation. What examples does he use for that?
Right. He points to some really stark examples, things like the forced unification of Yemen's two parts, or what he calls the swallowing of Kuwait by Iraq and Lebanon by Syria. These weren't, organic mergers, they were impositions, which just cements that feeling of division, even with all the unity talk.
So unity imposed by force isn't really unity at all.
Precisely. And then he gets quite cynical about economic unity. He says for Arabs, it's basically meant only a unity of destitution.
A unity of destitution. What does that mean?
A shared experience, he says, of empty stomachs, hunger, and displacement. From Mauritania to the Comoros Islands. It's a bleak picture.
So shared misery, not a shared vision. And he even points out this specific irony, something about the only unity really given by the West being through satellite TV and the internet.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point he makes. He argues this has led to endless chats and frivolities, people staying up all night online. He sees it as contributing to the middle class in the Arab world actually falling, prices soaring. And ironically, the main unifying factor becomes what he calls the war for bread, just the daily struggle to survive.
Pushing bigger concerns like Palestine or Iraq into the background.
That's his view, yeah. They become secondary, or even third place, overshadowed by that immediate need to just get by. 2. The paradox of resistance. Local oppressor versus foreign occupier.
Okay, so if that's the political and economic backdrop, this deep frustration, these external pressures, he then turns inward, doesn't he? He poses this really challenging question about individual resistance. This is a fascinating paradox he explores. Why does the Arab individual fight so fiercely against any foreign occupier, giving everything they have, yet their zeal cools and their spirit dies when they face what he calls another kind of occupation ruled by a local tyrant? What's his explanation for that?
That's a tough question, and it leads to this really striking assertion in the source. He claims that the oppression by a son of the land, a native tyrant, has actually proven more destructive, more repressive, lethal, and displacing than foreign rule.
More destructive than foreign rule. That's a heavy statement.
It is. He even draws a comparison to Ottoman rule. He notes that back then resistance was often just limited to praying against the perpetrators, even though the Ottomans were known for, impaling people who disobeyed.
That's quite the comparison. So his argument is that after the European powers divided and occupied the region and then eventually left, what kind of legacy remained?
He suggests they left behind successors and heirs. These were the local rulers. And the implication is that the Western powers found that Arabs would, quote, accept injustice and humiliation provided that the faces and colors do not change.
Oof, that's harsh.
It is. And the author then marvels at this transformation he sees. The seemingly docile citizen, suffering under a local ruler, suddenly becomes, in his words, Samson the Giant, Superman, Spider-Man, and Rambo the moment they're confronted by a direct foreign occupier.
It's a very sharp commentary on what he sees as selective courage or maybe selective resistance. 3. Living under the gaze. The pervasive surveillance state. Okay, building on this idea of internal pressures, the source makes this chilling declaration. It says, "It is not strange for an Arab to be watched from cradle to grave, but it is a source of pride for us to be watched by everyone who comes and goes." That paints a picture of truly pervasive surveillance. What different layers of this monitoring does he describe? And what's his tone? Is it really pride?
Oh, the tone is deeply ironic, I think. Bitter, perhaps. He details multiple layers, both internal and external. Internally, you have the official state agents, he calls them spies and newssuckers, paid informants. But then he says there are countless others who do the job for free, maybe to get in good with the authorities or maybe just out of personal grudges.
Leading to fabricated reports.
Exactly. Fabricated reports that, as he puts it, reach the bottom among the fangs of the system's hyenas and lions. A very evocative image.
And he highlights this bitter irony, too. These security agencies are supposedly great at finding enemies of the homeland.
Right, but they claim helplessness when it comes to catching common criminals, thieves, fraudsters, and the corrupt, who he says abound in our Arab world from Morocco to the Comoros.
So selective effectiveness there as well. How does he connect this internal surveillance to the external gaze?
Well, he describes external surveillance really vividly. He talks about spy satellites, claiming there are more of them than communication satellites, and listening devices placed within Arab countries transmitting every conversation, every secret, every plot, he says, straight to America and Israel, counting, quote, every step of an ant with extreme precision.
Wow, that's intense. He even brings media into it, like Al Jazeera.
Yes. He suggests that while channels like Al Jazeera claim to offer free opinion and democratic dialogue, they implicitly functioned as a kind of large human laboratory, a way for Western intelligence to gather insights into what people on the Arab street were thinking. Ultimately, he sees it as another means of control.
And it doesn't stop at information, does it? He mentions financial surveillance, too.
That's right. He talks about facilitated and veiled loans and credit. The idea being they're designed to empty people's pockets and uncover hidden wealth that traditional spying couldn't reach. It creates this broad survey of how money is moving internally within the Arab world. It's really an all-encompassing picture of a society under constant watch.
4. A crisis of values, misguided fatwas, corrupt culture, and lost language.
Okay, shifting focus a bit now, the author also expresses real shock at what he sees as a deep crisis of values. He starts with a specific example, a Syrian mufti's religious decree, a fatwa. This fatwa declared that attending an Arab summit was actually a religious obligation, implying leaders who didn't go would be sinful. What's the author's issue here? Right, and here's where it gets really interesting, I think. The author is incensed because he points out that these same religious figures were conspicuously silent during horrific events. He mentions massacres like Hama, Jisr al-Shugur, and Tadmor in the 1980s, or just the general humiliation of people, starvation, arbitrary imprisonment, even using children as human shields.
Silence on those huge issues.
Exactly. But they do issue fatwas on things like, well, kissing between genders. He sees it as profound hypocrisy, massively misplaced priorities and religious guidance.
And this critique of values extends to culture, too, like tourism.
Yes, he critically examines Arab tourism. He describes it as having sort of devolved, focusing on things like khat.
That's the stimulant leaf, right?
Yes, and shisha, or hookah, hashish, temporary marriages, public dancing, things he sees as morally questionable, and he argues this often happens with a kind of implicit government approval, while religious figures just offer these vague, veiled moral hints. He sees it as a society losing its moral compass.
Which leads him to something he seems particularly passionate about, the decline of the Arabic language. He sees this as a primary cause of Arab decline and regression. Why such a strong emphasis on language?
It's central to his argument. He points to the widespread adoption of the colonizers' languages, English, French, Spanish in official settings, universities, even just daily conversation. For him, this isn't just practical. This linguistic degradation is a shame. It reflects a much deeper societal decline, a loss of identity and cultural foundation.
And he makes this surprising point, too, doesn't he? That many common Western words actually have Arabic origins.
Yeah, it's quite fascinating. He suggests hello comes from Alan, okay, from waka, which means yes in some North African dialect.
Wow, I didn't know that. He mentions food words, too.
Right, like pizza from kubeza, maybe meaning a small flatbread, or spaghetti from izbakithir, literally many fingers, and the Spanish paella from albakia, meaning the rest or leftovers.
So for him, these aren't just fun facts. They highlight this deep historical influence, making the current decline of Arabic feel even worse.
Exactly. He even suggests the English word God might derive from Arabic terms like al-Gad, meaning the morrow, or Alila, the deity, similar to Spanish and Italian Dio. So seeing Arabic in this state of degradation is deeply poignant for him, and he contrasts it sharply with Israel's revival of Hebrew,
making it a modern global language.
Right, a globally recognized, technologically integrated language. He holds that up as a clear counterpoint to what he sees happening with Arabic, via Egypt's unique path and the broader Arab condition.
Now, amidst all this sweeping critique, the source does single out one country as somewhat unique, Egypt. How does he differentiate Egypt from other Arab nations?
Well, he describes Egyptians as having a kind of inherent determination for unity and unification, and also an aversion to violence. He contrasts this with what he sees as the more conflict-prone nature of places like Iraq and Lebanon at the time. He points to Egypt's history of relatively peaceful transitions. He even cites King Farouk's departure into exile. It was respectful, not violent, unlike what often happens to opponents in other Arab states.
Where it might be killing or imprisonment and torture, as he puts it.
Exactly, that's the contrast he draws.
But even with this unique character, he warns of a coming collapse of the Egyptian street. What specific threats does he see driving that potential collapse?
He points to what he calls a war of bread, essentially, forced starvation through economic policy. And he talks about systematic and accelerating plots to destabilize the country. He gets specific, mentioning large-scale land purchases in Sinai, over 8 million square meters by foreign capital, which he says is mostly Israeli.
That's a huge amount of land.
It is. And also the privatization of major state-owned economic institutions happening at the same time basic subsidies, like for bread, are being removed. He sees this as directly threatening the fundamental right to life for ordinary Egyptians.
Shifting from Egypt to broader patterns, the author uses these really colorful, almost humorous, but very cutting terms to categorize Arab officials based on corruption. Can you explain those?
Yes, it's quite memorable. He talks about degrees of corruption, Abu Shafada, which literally means something like father of the siphoner or the sucker for those taking over $5 million.
Okay.
Then Abu Bakya, meaning father of the small bundle, for those taking between $500,000 and $5 million.
And the lowest tier.
That's Abu Shishib, which implies maybe father of the small sip, or just a crumb for those taking under $500,000. It's a darkly comedic way of mapping out the scale of graft he perceives.
It really is. And he coins another term, too, Arabocracy. What's that about?
He describes Arabocracy as a, quote, desperate Arab attempt to apply democracy. He says it typically goes through stages. First stage, see nothing, hear nothing, speak nothing. Second, see and hear, but do not speak. And the final stage, see and hear and speak to myself.
So a very cynical take on the slow, maybe stalled progress towards real political expression.
Very much so. And he's just as critical of Arab opposition movements that operate outside their home countries. How does he portray them?
He sees them as pretty ineffective, frankly. Fortified behind computers and screens is how he puts it. Engaging in rhetorical bombardment online rather than concrete action that makes a difference. He seems quite dismissive.
And he gives this powerful example of what he sees as a major double standard when it comes to justice in the region.
Right, this involves Rafat al-Assad.
Yes. He notes there was no real consensus or push to prosecute figures like Rafat al-Assad, who was implicated in the 1982 Hama massacre, an event causing, according to the source, 30,000 deaths and 500,000 displacements. Yet there was international support and funding for trials, like Saddam Hussein's, or the one related to Rafik Hariri's assassination.
So, a selective application of justice, depending on who the figure is. And he takes his point even further drawing a really stark comparison.
He does. He argues, quite provocatively, that the only living people in our region is the Jewish people in Israel and abroad.
Why does he say that?
Because, he argues, they relentlessly pursue justice for their historical grievances. He uses the example of prosecuting remaining Nazis. He contrasts this with Arabs who, in his view, engage in wailing and lamentations about injustices. But these are soon forgotten, and accountability isn't pursued with the same vigor.
That's an incredibly harsh self-assessment of the Arab world's perceived inability to achieve justice or accountability for itself. 6. A voice for change. The author's initiatives. Okay, so despite this incredibly bleak, often cynical critique running through almost everything we've discussed, the source does end by highlighting the author's own efforts. He wasn't just criticizing, he was trying to push for change.
Right. It shows he wasn't just an armchair critic. For instance, he announced the establishment of the Damascus Declaration Office in Spain back in March 2008. The aim was peaceful, democratic transformation in Syria. It explicitly opposed things like emergency laws, arbitrary arrests, and it specifically advocated for Kurdish rights. So, very concrete political goals.
And he had other plans too, something about a TV channel.
Yes, quite an ambitious project for a pan-Arab satellite TV channel. The plan was for it to broadcast in 4 languages: Arabic, Spanish, English, and French.
Wow. What was the vision behind that?
It was conceived not just as a free, non-political voice for Syrians and Arabs generally, but also as an investment opportunity. The idea was that profits could then be used to support opposition efforts and humanitarian work.
So a dual purpose.
Yeah.
Media influence and funding the cause.
Exactly. A pragmatic approach, trying to build something sustainable.
And finally, the source mentions one more initiative, something very practical. A bank.
Yes, a proposal for a non-governmental bank for food, medicine, and educational books. The idea here was to directly address the most basic needs of Arabs struggling with poverty and displacement, essentially bypassing official channels to get aid directly to people who needed it most urgently. Outro. So this deep dive into Dr. Murad Aga-Daftardar's writings from 2008, it really reveals this poignant snapshot of disillusionment, doesn't it? But also incisive criticism, and beneath it all, a real longing for genuine change within the Arab world. The author's observations, I mean, they're specific to that time, 2008, but they touch on themes that still resonate, across regions, across eras, that gap between rhetoric and reality.
Yeah, the complexities of internal struggles versus external ones, and just the profound impact of how people are governed on their daily lives. So what does this all mean for you, listening now? How do these critiques, which are almost 2 decades old, how do they reflect challenges that might still be ongoing? Or maybe, are there signs of progress we can see now? The author once wrote something that really sticks with you. He said, "We are the most watched people in the world. We have no choice but to be happy because we are a subject of interest to humanity, not out of love, but in anticipation of the reactions of the poor and distressed when they see their livelihoods, wealth, and history disappear into nothingness."
That's a really provocative thought to end on. What does it actually mean to be perpetually observed like that? To be an object of interest, but maybe not out of affection, more like anticipation. And what kind of agency, or, what kind of smile, as he puts it, is truly left when so much feels like it's predetermined by forces both outside and inside? Something to think about.